We act like the refrigerator invented food safety. It did not. It simply made us stop thinking. Somewhere in this list, there is a technique that kept eggs edible for a full year. No electricity, no cold, no technology beyond a glass jar and a handful of minerals. There is a method a great-grandmother used every single winter that eliminated food waste so completely she never once threw out a meal. And the secret at the very bottom of this list ran every kitchen in America for 2 centuries, before it disappeared so quietly that most people today have never heard its name. These are not survival tricks from a desperate time. They are a system, a complete, deliberate, remarkably intelligent system, built by people who could not afford to waste a single egg, a single cup of milk, a single hour of heat from the stove. Number 25, water glassing. Before electricity reached most American farmhouses, eggs were a seasonal problem. Hens laid heavily in spring and summer, then slowed almost to nothing through the cold months. Families learned to store the surplus by dissolving sodium silicate, a mineral compound available at any general store, in water, then submerging fresh, unwashed eggs completely in the solution. Sealed in a ceramic crock and kept in a cool corner of the cellar, those eggs stayed edible for 9 to 12 months. The coating sealed the shell's pores and stopped bacteria from entering. USDA extension bulletins from the early 20th century documented this method across rural communities from Ohio to Oregon. Families who mastered it ate eggs in January that they had collected in April. Number 24, the root cellar. Dig 4 feet into the earth and the temperature stabilizes. It does not matter if it is July in Kansas or February in Minnesota. The ground holds between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round at that depth. American farm families had known this for generations. They built small rooms beneath their homes or into hillsides, lined the walls with shelves, and stored potatoes, carrots, turnips, cabbages, apples, and beets through the entire winter without a single degree of mechanical refrigeration. The root cellar was not a backup plan. It was the plan. A family that dug a good cellar in September could feed itself through April on what they had grown in their own yard. Number 23, dry curing pork. In the Midwest, November was butchering month. The cold had arrived, flies were gone, and the work could be done cleanly. Hogs were slaughtered, the meat was packed in coarse salt, rubbed hard into every surface, every joint, every cavity, then hung in the smokehouse or the cellar. The salt drew moisture out and created an environment where bacteria could not survive. Families worked through this process from November to March, producing hams and bacon that would carry them through the following year. The technique required no equipment beyond salt, time, and cold air. It produced meat that was shelf-stable for months without refrigeration of any kind. Number 22, lard sealing. When cooked meat needed to be preserved beyond a day or two, fat was the answer. In German-American households across Pennsylvania and the South, families poured rendered lard over cooked pork, chicken, or goose, filling every gap until the meat sat completely submerged beneath a solid layer of white fat. Sealed from air, the meat beneath stayed safe for weeks. When dinner came, they lifted the lid, pulled out what they needed, and smoothed the lard back down over the rest. Nothing was wasted. The lard itself was used again and again, flavoring everything it touched until the last piece of meat was gone. Number 21, mason jar canning. In 1858, a tinsmith from New Jersey named John Landis Mason patented a glass jar with a threaded neck and a metal lid that created an airtight seal. It changed how American families stored food more than almost any invention before or since. By the time the First World War arrived, the United States government was actively promoting home canning as a patriotic act. During the Second World War, the Victory Garden program extended that further. Families across the country grew vegetables in their backyards and preserved them in mason jars by the dozens, by the hundreds. A woman who put up 200 quarts of tomatoes, green beans, and corn in August could feed her family through winter without spending $1 at the store. Number 20, smoking. Smoke is not flavor, smoke is chemistry. The compounds in wood smoke, phenols, aldehydes, organic acids penetrate the surface of meat and create a hostile environment for the bacteria that cause spoilage. American families in the South and Midwest understood this not as science, but as practice. They built low fires from hickory, apple, or oak, maintained temperatures between 165 and 185 degrees Fahrenheit, and held the meat in that smoke for 6 to 12 hours. What came out of the smokehouse was not just preserved, it was transformed. The same shoulder of pork that would have spoiled in 2 days raw could now last for weeks, hanging in a cool, dry space, ready to be sliced whenever it was needed. Before continuing the count, consider what has just been described. Every single technique above was passed from one pair of hands to another. Not written in a book, not filmed, not posted anywhere. A grandmother showed a daughter how to test the water glass solution by feel. A mother showed a son how deep to pack the salt against the bone. The knowledge lived in kitchens, in the specific pressure of a hand on a jar lid, in the smell of smoke at the right temperature. In 1900, nearly 2 out of every 3 Americans lived in rural areas. By 1950, that number had dropped to 1 in 3. By 1970, it was 1 in 5. After the Second World War, 12 million veterans came home and did not go back to the farms their families had left. They moved to new suburbs, into houses with electric stoves and linoleum floors, and refrigerators already installed in the kitchen. Their wives had grown up in those same rural kitchens. But the new apartment had no smokehouse, no cellar, no yard for a crock of eggs. The knowledge did not get written down because it had never needed to be written down. It traveled by proximity, by watching, by standing in the same room for years until the skill became automatic. When the room changed, when the farm became a suburb and the family became a commuter household, the chain broke. Not violently, not all at once, quietly, one generation at a time, until the granddaughter had no idea what water glassing even meant. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is what happens when an entire country moves faster than its own memory. Number 19. The paper test. Before thermometers were standard kitchen equipment, bakers measured oven temperature with a single sheet of white paper. They slid it onto the rack and closed the door for 30 seconds. If the paper came out pale gold, the oven was sitting around 350 degrees Fahrenheit, right for cakes and bread. If it came out deep brown at the edges, the heat was above 400 degrees and the oven needed to cool before anything delicate went in. If it scorched, the fire was too high and needed banking down immediately. This was not guesswork. It was calibration built from years of repetition, refined into a single observable fact that anyone in the kitchen could read. Number 18, the spring house. In Appalachia and across the mid-Atlantic states, families built small stone structures directly over cold running streams. The water flowing beneath kept the interior temperature around 50 degrees Fahrenheit through even the hottest summer months. Crocks of butter, pails of fresh milk, and jars of cream sat on shelves just above the water, kept cold by the earth and the current beneath them. A good spring house was worth more to a farm family than almost any other structure on the property. It was the reason they could have butter in August. It was the reason fresh milk could sit for a day without souring. Number 17, charcoal filtering. Before municipal water systems reached rural communities, families drew water from wells and streams that were not always reliable. They filtered it through layers of clean charcoal packed into wooden barrels or ceramic containers. The charcoal absorbed organic compounds, reduced odor, and cleared the water enough for cooking and drinking. The same principle was applied to milk that had picked up off flavors in transit. A small piece of clean charcoal suspended in a cloth, held in the pail for a few hours, brought it back. The science behind activated charcoal filtration is now used in water treatment plants across the country. American farm families were running a version of it in their kitchens 100 years before it had a technical name. Number 16, fermentation. German families in Pennsylvania, Polish families in Ohio, Czech families in Wisconsin, they all arrived carrying the same knowledge. Cabbage packed in salt and left in a ceramic crock at room temperature for 2 to 4 weeks became sauerkraut, stable for months without refrigeration. Cucumbers submerged in a brine of 1 tablespoon of salt per cup of water, weighted down with a stone to stay under the liquid, fermented in 3 to 7 days into pickles that could sit in a cool cellar through winter. The salt and the lactic acid bacteria did the preserving. The family did nothing except wait. In a pre-refrigerator kitchen, patience was a preservation technique. Number 15. The hay box. During the First World War, the USDA distributed instructions for a device called a hay box cooker. The principle was direct. Bring a pot of beans, soup, or stew to a full boil on the stove. Transfer the entire pot into a wooden box lined with packed hay or old blankets, any dense insulating material. Close the lid. Leave it for 4 to 8 hours. The insulation held the heat inside the pot long enough to finish cooking the food completely, using no additional fuel. In a period when coal and wood had to be purchased or cut and carried, 4 hours of fuel-free cooking, heat was not a minor convenience. It was the difference between a hot meal every day and a hot meal twice a week. Number 14. Lard as a preservative. Crisco arrived in American kitchens in 1911, marketed as a cleaner and more modern alternative to animal fat. Before that, lard was the universal cooking medium, and it did far more than fry. Poured hot over cooked meat or vegetables and allowed to solidify, it created an airtight seal that held food safely for days or weeks in a cool space. Baked goods made with lard stayed moist longer than those made with butter because lard has a lower water content. The fat was never discarded. It was strained, stored in a tin near the stove, and reused until it was gone. A household that rendered its own lard from a single hog in November had cooking fat that could last well into the following year. Number 13. The ice delivery system. In American cities from the 1820s through the 1930s, ice was a commodity cut from frozen lakes and rivers during winter, packed in sawdust inside enormous storage warehouses, and delivered door to door by horse-drawn wagons through the warmer months. Families bought it by the pound. They placed it in insulated wooden ice boxes, the direct predecessor of the modern refrigerator, and managed their cold storage carefully, knowing exactly how many days a block would last and planning their shopping around it. The iceman's schedule determined what a family could keep and for how long. An icebox kitchen required a fundamentally different approach than a refrigerator kitchen. Everything had to be accounted for in advance. Nothing could be set aside and forgotten. Number 12. Smoking fish. Along the rivers and coastlines of New England and the Pacific Northwest, fish was the protein a family could obtain cheaply and in quantity if they knew how to keep it. Freshwater fish and salmon were split, salted lightly, and hung in the smokehouse over a slow fire for 12 to 24 hours until the flesh dried and darkened completely through. Smoked fish required no further preservation and could be carried without refrigeration for weeks. Native American communities across the Pacific Northwest had developed this technique centuries before European settlement, and the families who moved into those regions learned it directly, recognizing its precision for what it was. Number 11. Dry goods management. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, rice, and oats were bought in large quantities when prices were low, and stored in lidded tins or ceramic crocks to keep out moisture and pests. A family that bought a 50-pound sack of flour in September and stored it correctly had bread flour through February. The management of dry goods was its own discipline, rotating stock so the oldest was used first, checking regularly for moisture or insects, knowing exactly what was on hand at all times. Waste was not an accident in those kitchens. It was a failure of management, and it was treated accordingly. Number 10. Vinegar preservation. Long before commercial pickling became an industry, American home kitchens used vinegar the way they use salt as a tool for extending the life of food that would otherwise spoil within days. Beets, cucumbers, green beans, and pearl onions were packed into jars and covered with a hot solution of vinegar, water, salt, and sometimes sugar or spices. Sealed while hot and stored in a cool pantry, they kept for a year or more. The acidity of the vinegar lowered the pH of the food below the threshold at which spoilage organisms could survive. Families in the South pickled watermelon rind. Families in New England pickled hard-boiled eggs. Whatever the garden produced in excess, the vinegar jar could hold. Those first 15 techniques share a common characteristic. They are mechanical. They are things a person does to food, using physical materials and learned procedures. The next part of this list is different. These are not techniques. They are the organizing principles that made every technique above possible. The techniques above did not disappear because they stopped working. They disappeared because the people who carried them ran out of time. In 1950, 34% of American women were part of the paid workforce. By 1980, that number had climbed to 51%. By the end of the century, it was 57%. That shift represented millions of households where the person who had previously spent 6 hours a day managing a kitchen now had 6 fewer hours to spend. The haybox cooker that saved 4 hours of fuel required 30 minutes of setup. The fermentation crock that produced 3 months of pickles required monitoring every 2 days for a week. Water glassing eggs required sourcing the mineral, preparing the solution, and checking the crock through the season. None of it was difficult. All of it required time that was no longer available. The processed food industry did not create this gap. It identified it and filled it. A can of vegetables that took 90 seconds to open and heat replaced a process that had taken 3 days to complete. The exchange was not driven by laziness. It was driven by arithmetic. Once a generation grew up eating from cans rather than crocks, the knowledge of how to fill those crocks did not automatically return. It simply was not there anymore. Number 9, triage eating. In a kitchen without refrigeration, the sequence in which food was consumed was not a matter of preference. It was a matter of necessity. Whatever was closest to spoiling was eaten first, every single time, without exception. The soft tomato went into that evening's soup. The bread that was beginning to dry went into the next day's stuffing. The milk that was starting to turn went immediately into baked goods, where the heat would neutralize any bacteria and the acid would improve the rise. Nothing sat until it was gone. This approach was not a system anyone designed. It was the outcome of not being able to afford waste, practiced so consistently that it became instinct. Number 8, seasonal eating. Before refrigeration, a Midwest family did not eat tomatoes in December. They did not eat strawberries in February. They did not eat corn in March. The rhythm of the kitchen followed the rhythm of the land with absolute fidelity, because there was no alternative. What the garden produced in July was what you ate in July, and what you put up in jars was what you ate in January. This enforced calendar produced something modern kitchens have nearly lost entirely: a direct understanding of what food actually tastes like when consumed at the correct moment. A tomato grown in a home garden in August and eaten the same day is a categorically different object from a tomato shipped from a greenhouse 1,000 miles away in midwinter. Number 7, nose to tail. American families in the 1930s used approximately 90% of every animal they slaughtered. The liver and kidneys were eaten within the first day because they spoiled fastest. Tougher cuts were braised low and slow over long cooking times. The bones were cracked and simmered for stock. The fat was rendered into lard. Pig skin was salted and fried. Nothing with caloric value left the kitchen unused. According to USDA estimates, Americans today discard roughly 30 to 40% of all food purchased. The distance between those two numbers is not a product of technology. It reflects a fundamental shift in the relationship between a household and its food supply, to the animal, to the cost, and to the direct consequence of waste. Number 6, bone broth as currency. Every bone that passed through a pre-refrigerator kitchen had a second life. Roasted bones went into a pot of cold water with accumulated vegetable scraps, onion skins, celery tops, carrot ends, and simmered for hours until the liquid turned deep amber and coated the back of a spoon. That stock became the base of the next 3 meals. It went into the gravy. It replaced water in the bread dough. It was the braising liquid that converted a cheaper cut of meat into something tender enough to eat. Fannie Farmer's Boston Cooking School cookbook, published in 1896, treated stock making as the foundational skill of the kitchen, the first competency a cook needed to develop before anything else. A kitchen that produced stock from its scraps wasted almost nothing, because the scraps had already paid for the next meal. Number 5, cook once, eat 3 times. A pot roast prepared on Sunday produced the hot meal for Sunday dinner. The remaining meat was sliced cold for Monday sandwiches. The cooking liquid and leftover vegetables became Tuesday's soup. The bones went into Wednesday's stock. 4 meals from 1 afternoon of work. This approach was not considered a form of resourcefulness in those kitchens. It was simply how cooking functioned. The concept of preparing a separate, complete meal from raw ingredients every night of the week would have registered to most mid-century American housewives as an unnecessary and costly use of both time and money. Number 4. The pantry as a system. A well-maintained pantry in a pre-refrigerator home was not a convenience feature. It was operating infrastructure. Families kept written inventories of what was on hand, rotating stock with the discipline of a small warehouse. They knew exactly how many jars of green beans remained from last summer's canning run, how many pounds of dried beans were in the tin, how much cornmeal was left in the crock. Shopping happened infrequently because the pantry was built to carry a family for weeks between trips to the store. The pantry was managed the way a business manages supply, because for those families, it was a supply system, and a shortage carried real consequences. Number 3. Salt as a tool, not a seasoning. A modern cook reaches for salt at the end of cooking to adjust flavor. In a pre-refrigerator kitchen, salt was deployed at the start, throughout the process, and sometimes at the end because its primary function was not taste. It was chemistry. Salt draws moisture out of food through osmosis, producing conditions where bacteria cannot establish. It was the first line of preservation in nearly every technique on this list. Dry curing required it. Fermentation operated on it. Vinegar pickling incorporated it. Brining depended on it. Treating salt as a preservation tool rather than a seasoning reframes every technique that preceded it. Salt was not the ingredient. Salt was the underlying technology. Number 2. Reading food with your hand. Before kitchen thermometers, before instant red probes, before countdown timers calibrated to the second, the primary diagnostic instrument in an American kitchen was the human hand. Bakers pressed bread dough to determine whether it had proofed correctly. A finger pressed in should leave an impression that slowly filled back. Cooks assessed pan heat by holding a palm 2 inches above the surface and counting how many seconds passed before they had to pull it away. Meat was pressed to evaluate doneness by resistance. Jam was tested by dropping a spoonful onto a cold plate and observing how it set. These assessments were not approximations. They were calibrated skills built from thousands of repetitions, reliable enough to produce consistent results every time. Number 1. Cold is a direction, not a destination. Every technique on this list, every crock, every smokehouse, every salt rub, every jar sealed against air, was constructed on a single underlying principle that the modern kitchen has nearly abandoned. Cold does not preserve food. Cold slows the biological and chemical processes that cause spoilage. And once a person understands that spoilage is a process, biological, chemical, and controllable, it becomes clear that there are dozens of points at which that process can be interrupted, and mechanical refrigeration is only one of them. The people who built these kitchens did not have refrigerators. They had something more durable, a working understanding of how food actually functions, what it requires to remain safe, what conditions allow it to fail, and how to manipulate those conditions using nothing beyond salt, time, smoke, acid, fat, and patience. That understanding sustained this country's kitchens for 2 centuries. It kept families fed through economic collapses, through 2 world wars, through long winters when the nearest store was 20 miles out and the roads were impassable. It did not leave because it failed. It left because the conditions that made it necessary changed, and with them went the incentive to remember. That is a very different thing from failure. Think about the person in your family who knew these things. Perhaps there is a memory of a cellar with shelves of jars. Perhaps a particular smell, wood smoke or brine, or something that resisted naming, that came from a corner of a kitchen spent time in as a child. Perhaps hands that moved through a kitchen with a quiet confidence that seemed effortless, and that now is understood to have not been effortless at all. It was the product of a system learned over years, transmitted through proximity, practiced until it required no conscious thought. According to USDA estimates, Americans today discard between 30 and 40% of everything purchased at the grocery store. The people who built these kitchens discarded almost nothing. The kitchen was the one room in the house where nothing was wasted and nothing was forgotten, where the daily work of keeping a family intact was done without announcement, by people who never considered it extraordinary, because it simply had to be done. If any part of this reached something in you, share it with someone who would want to know. Subscribe if you want more. And the next time a bone goes into the trash, consider what it would have become in a different kitchen, in a different time.